I'm just going to wait for the presentation to pop up in a second here. If you go back one slide and click on my name, it'll pop up there for you, Gene. There we go. And we'll go to the next slide as we talk about two Cajun pastors this morning. Let's see. They may look something like that. I don't know. One was named Reverend Boudreau. He was the part-time pastor of the local Cajun Baptist church. And the other's name was Pastor Thibodeau. And he was the minister of the Covenant Church across the road. Well, they're both standing by the road one day, pounding the sign into the ground that read, "The end is near. Turn yourself around now before it's too late." They wrote signs in that Cajun dialect, I'm sure. Well, as the car sped past them, the driver leaned out his window and yelled, "You religious nuts!" And from the curve, they heard screeching tires and a big splash. And Bordeaux turns to Thibodeau and asks, "Do you think maybe the sign should just say, 'Bridge out'?" Well, the signs and symbols we Christians use are not always clear or welcomed by those outside our faith. I have a few signs that I came across this week I thought I'd share with you this morning, and we might appreciate that one. "Keep using my name in vain, I'll make rush hour longer," from God. This one, "Staying in bed shouting, 'Oh God,' does not constitute going to church." And the last one here, "Do not criticize your wife's judgment, see whom she married." I like those. Sometimes I have to get ideas for what to put out there on our sign, but never want to offend anyone, so I'm always nervous about that. But perhaps the most controversial sign of our faith, though, is one that over time we may become desensitized to. And this sign or symbol is the cross of Christ. If we are to look around in this worship space here this morning, what would we see? What would we see at the forefront of our worship? Of course, the cross. For most of us, we might turn and we see the large wooden cross against the back wall. But if we look carefully, we see lots of other images of the cross here. Who else can spot one? There is the brass one. There's a cross on the pole when we process in and recess out. There's a cross in many of these windows, actually, if you look carefully, whether it's be on a pole or on a church, depicted in those windows. We see them engraved in the pulpit, in the prayer desks, and other furniture. We might have them, depending on the stole I'm wearing, we have a certain aspect of the cross. They're all over the place.
Choir.
And the choir. Did I hear someone from the choir? Oh, yes, of course, the choir with the crosses on their robes. It's a symbol that's become synonymous with our faith. Even if we move through the worship service, there are various places that myself, as the priest, would make the sign of the cross, or some sign of the cross. And I'm not the most overly formal priest, I think. But when I started thinking about all those times that the cross appears in the worship, I started thinking about it. I was thinking about, well, let's see, we do the cross with when I pronounce the absolution, we do that. We do the cross when we're celebrating communion several times. And the cross, often some of us might be our practice to cross ourselves before we receive the bread and wine or after. When I'm saying the prayer of consecration over the bread and the wine, if you watch my hands, I'm making the sign of the cross over the bread and the wine. When you come forward to receive the bread, before I hand you the bread, I actually make a little sign of the cross before putting it in your hand. And of course, at the end of the priestly blessing, at the end of the service, there's also the sign of the cross is given. The danger, I think, sometimes when we have a symbol that we use so much over and over again is that sometimes we might become desensitized to it. Sometimes we might take that symbol for granted. It's one of the reasons why in the liturgical calendar we have a day like today where we celebrate the Holy Cross, where we pay special recognition to the meaning and significance of the Holy Cross. The Book of Common Prayer calls today the Feast of the Exaltation of the Holy Cross. BCP always has nice fancy words for things, doesn't it? I'm going to share a little bit about the history, just really briefly, about where this day came from and why we do it. Now, according to legends that spread widely, the true cross, that is the cross, the actual cross of Christ that he was crucified on, was discovered in the year 326 by Saint Helena, the mother of the Roman Empire, Constantine the Great, during a pilgrimage she made to Jerusalem. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre was then built at the site of the discovery by order of Helena and Constantine. The church was dedicated 9 years later with a portion of the cross placed inside it. Other legends explain that in 614, that portion of the cross was carried away from the church by the Persians and remained missing until it was recaptured by the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius in 628. Initially taken to Constantinople, the cross was returned to the church the following year. Now, the date of the feast marks the dedication of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in 335. And it was a 2-day festival. One day was the consecration of the church, and the next day they actually brought the cross outside the church where the clergy and faithful could pray before the true cross. Now, whatever we might think of these kinds of legends and stories and traditions, there is no denying the fact that the ancient church sensed something essential about having a day set apart to honor the cross. Now, it's true that the cross is set before us throughout Lent, especially on Good Friday. But those days focus squarely on Christ's passion and don't necessarily deal with the symbol of the cross directly. But we know the cross, and of course what it represented, was of paramount importance to Christ's followers. Take the Apostle Paul, for example. We hear the Apostle Paul declare in today's reading that the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to those who are being saved, it is the power of God. Why was the message of the cross foolishness to those outside the faith? Why did they have such a hard time with what the cross represented? Now, if I were to ask you what the cross means to you today, I'm going to guess that you'd probably say something like, well, it means love or peace. It might mean a degree of sadness that you feel as you remember Jesus dying on the cross. But what if I were to tell you that for people living at this time, in Paul's time, the cross was about as comforting a symbol as a swastika would be for us? When we see this image, what do we think? What do we feel? Depending on our backgrounds, our European heritage, we might think different things. But the cross in the ancient days was the cruelest form of punishment the Romans could come up with to keep the populace in line. They used to line the road to Rome with crosses and with people crucified on those crosses, and they left their bodies there to be picked at and eaten by animals, so that all who walked into Rome, who came into that city, would fear Rome, would fear the emperor. For these people, the symbol of the cross was one of fear and terror, one that expressed the brutal power and strength of the empire. The cross evoked feelings of fear and hatred and represented the horrible acts of humanity. And Paul calls the message of the cross the power of God. Paul was convinced that God did something incredible on the cross. He suffered the consequences of human sin and wickedness. In Christ, God brought together humanity and divinity and shows us that his love is so great that he would suffer with us. True empathy endures the pain and brokenness of others. And Jesus teaches us this. And by taking on our pain, Christ heals and restores us and promises us resurrected life. That's what Jesus is trying to tell his disciples in our gospel today. He alludes to the story of Moses and Israel when the people were sick and dying as a result of their sin, and God had Moses craft a bronze serpent and put it up on a pole. Moses was to raise this pole high. It was to be up where the people could see it. And when they looked up at it, they were cured. Jesus also was raised up on a cross. And all who would behold him would be healed from the plagues of sin and death. In this great sacrificial act, God uses a symbol of death and turns it into a symbol of life. What the Romans used for torture and intimidation, God uses for healing and restoration. Now I'd like us to think about this. If God can take a symbol of torture, suffering, and death, redeem it, and transform it into a symbol of love, hope, and life, then what do you think God could do with us? What can God do with your past, with your heavy burdens, with your guilt and sin? What could this God do with your fears and anxieties, insecurities, and weaknesses? If God can change an evil image, a horrifying symbol, and turn it into a symbol and a sign of life, what could he do with us? Gene, if you can flip 2 slides down. Today we are invited to behold the cross again in order to fix ourselves or attach ourselves, our souls, our weaknesses to Jesus. Augustine, one of the early church leaders, has this to say about beholding Christ on the cross. You may wish to look at the image on the screen. The image on the screen might be difficult to look at. You might want to close your eyes and use your imaginations instead. But I invite you to take a moment to reflect with me. To place ourselves in that scene around the cross of Christ with the disciples, with onlookers, Roman soldiers, as they were looking on him. So we too gaze on his wounds as he hangs. We see his blood as he dies. We see the price offered by the Redeemer. Touch the scars of his resurrection. He bows his head as if to kiss you. His heart is made bare open, as it were, in love to you. His arms are extended that he may embrace you. His whole body is displayed for your redemption. Ponder how great these things are. Let all this be rightly weighed in your mind. As he was fixed to the cross in every part of his body for you, so he may now be fixed in every part of your soul. My friends, this cross is for you, and it is for me. When we make the sign of the cross, may it be a symbolic act of fixing ourselves to the cross of Christ, fixing ourselves to Christ, allowing Christ to be fixed, attached, connected to us, that we receive God's love and forgiveness, that we open ourselves to his mercy, and he may truly change and transform us from something less than good into something beautiful and life-giving. Oh, sing a new song unto the Lord, for he has done marvelous things. All the ends of the earth have seen the victory of God. Amen.